Hello everyone. In this session, we are going to learn about neural networks and deep learning. So first, let's start with understanding what we are going to learn exactly. First, we learn about what perceptrons are. Next, we'll build what we have learned in perceptrons to understand what neural networks are. Then we'll try to understand various kinds of activation functions or non-linearities which are present in neural networks. Then we'll see how to optimize our neural networks using gradient descent. And finally, we'll see the application on the MNIST dataset. After this is done, we'll have a look at what image processing is. Then we'll see how to artificially increase the size of your dataset using data augmentation. We'll have a look at an AutoML library, which is the PyTorch. We'll have a look at why machine learning became so popular, what was the driving force, which is GPUs or graphics processing units. And then we'll again see one more application on the CIFAR10 dataset. So let's start with what perceptrons are. A perceptron takes in multiple inputs and gives out one output, either a 0 or 1. So it can act as a simple decision maker. So based on the conditions or the inputs, which are x1, x2, and x3, we weigh these different terms by the factors w1, w2, and w3. We have a thresholding function over here. We add all of these weights, we threshold it, and based upon the threshold values, we generate an output 1 or 0. This kind of model can be used to create simple decisions, as we'll have a look at an example after this slide. Mathematically speaking, what we have is w1 into x1 plus w2 into x2 plus w3 into x3. So this is the terms we have, and combined they can be written as the dot product of a w vector which has w1, w2, and w3 components, and the x vector which has x1, x2, and x3 components. When you do a dot product, you get these values. We add a bias term to it, which is thresholding value, and if the value is less than 0, then the output is taken to be 0. If the sum is greater than 0, then we take the output as 1. So this is what a perceptron is. It can have as many number of inputs as you have in your decision making process. Corresponding to each input, there will be a weight which, when multiplied and added, will get a value. We threshold it to decide whether there is a binary output saying yes or no. So let's take an example of how you can use perceptrons to model your decision making process. So let's say we have a conundrum. We want to go outside. We want to watch, let's say, a movie, and the decision to watch the movie and go outside depends upon three factors. One is the weather outside. Second, how is the situation of COVID in your locality? And third, whether you have a girlfriend or a boyfriend to accompany you to the movies. Okay. So based on these three factors, you want to model the decision to go to a movie. Now you can use perceptrons to model this. Let's say if you have a girlfriend or a boyfriend, you take the value of your input as 1. Otherwise, you take the value as 0. I'm assuming most of you people would not have a girlfriend or a boyfriend. That is why I've taken it to be 0. Next, if the situation of COVID is bad in your locality, then you take the value to be 1. If it's okay, you do not have any COVID cases in your locality, you'll take the value to be 0. So that is the input for the COVID case. Next, there is the weather. If the weather is good, then we take a value 1. And if it is bad, then we take a value of 0. So these are the inputs, and this is my assumption right now regarding the current situation. Based on that, we want to factor all of these conditions and take the decision whether we want to go to the movies or not. So now, if we had a girlfriend or a boyfriend, then it's a very strong motivating factor to go to the movies. So that is why I have set the value as 100. But as we do not have any girlfriend or boyfriend, 0 into 100 will correspond to 0. So this does not contribute to the factor of going to the movies. Next, there is the COVID situation. As it is quite bad everywhere, I have taken it to be 1. And COVID being present in your locality should be a very big deterrent for going to the movies. So that is why I've taken a very large negative value if there is COVID in your locality. So that is why I've given it a weight of -100, and 1 into -100 corresponds to -100 over here in the output. Next, we have the weather. Let's assume the weather is good, and I have given it a smaller positive factor because COVID being present in your locality is a very big deterrent compared to the weather being good. So that is why I've given it a positive 50, and 1 multiplied by 50 will give plus 50 in the output. So -100 plus 50 corresponds to -50. Now there is the bias term. So if you are, let's say, biased towards going to the movies, you want to go to the movies, whatever be the situation, then your bias might be around 100. So if you add a plus 100 to this, then it goes greater than 0. It becomes 50 and it becomes greater than 0. Hence, you would go to the movies. If your bias is small, let's say it's 0, you're not biased towards going to the movies, you are just going to look at the decision making process, then you can set the bias to be 0. And finally, your output is -50, which is less than 0. So you are not going to go to the movies. So this is a very simple way of handling decisions using perceptrons. Before we start getting into complicated mathematics and understanding how neural networks work, how perceptrons work in large number of cases, let's have a quick revision of what matrix multiplication is. So let's say we have two matrices, A and B. When we multiply A and B, we do a matrix multiplication. First of all, there are some conditions which need to be satisfied so that the matrix multiplication is valid. So the number of columns of A should be equal to the number of rows of matrix B. If this condition is satisfied, then only the matrix multiplication is valid. And how do we do matrix multiplication? So you take the row of matrix A, you multiply each element with the corresponding element of column of matrix B, and then you put that value in the row. So if A had, we took the first row, in B we took the second column. So in the output matrix, let's call it C, we'll store the element wise product and sum in the location 1, 2, which is the first row, second column. Similarly, let's say we have the row 3, we multiply it with column 3, and we do element wise product and then add them up and store it in the third row, third column of the output matrix. If you do this for all the combinations of rows and columns, you'll get a matrix C which has the dimensions same as number of rows of A and number of columns of B. So that is C, which is the output of the matrix multiplication of A and B. So you can denote the perceptron uh, mathematical equation via matrices. So you can have multiple inputs. So you can see there are 5 inputs over here. So you have those 5 inputs and then you pass them on to each of the 3 different perceptrons. It's not necessary that we only have one perceptron when we are trying to calculate the output. We can have such complicated structures to denote decisions as well. Also, to make it more complicated, you can even skip the connections from one layer to a layer ahead. This means that you can have one input directly passing this layer and going into the next layer. So you can create complicated perceptrons, And to do the calculation, you can use matrices. So you have 5 inputs. You have, corresponding to each of these neurons, you have 5 weights. So you have a 5 cross 3 weight matrix. And when you multiply your inputs, which corresponds to 1 comma 5, you do a matrix multiplication, you'll get an output of 1 comma 3, which corresponds to the output of these perceptrons. Next, again, you'll have a matrix having dimensions 4 comma 3. And when you multiply your matrix 1 comma 3 with a matrix of 3 comma 4, you'll get an output of 1 comma 4. If you keep on doing this matrix multiplication, you'll finally get an output of 1 comma 1, and you'll get the final output. That is why we use matrices when we are trying to compute the output of each layer in the perceptrons. You'll see later on why we prefer matrices to store our weights, because that's interlinked with the computation that happens in the hardware. So we'll see at the end of the session why we use matrices and why we do not use any other data type to store our weights. Okay, so the next thing is, let's try to understand these perceptrons using a NAND gate. Let's try to understand whether our perceptrons can uh, take all kinds of decisions. So if we have the NAND gate truth table, people doing electrical engineering, electronics engineering might know that if you can create an AND gate, then it's called a universal gate, because you can combine NAND gate with any kind of other gates and create any gate possible. So you can create any Boolean logic by combining lots and lots of NAND gates. So if our perceptron is able to act as an AND gate, then that means that a perceptron can solve all Boolean uh, outputs. So it can model any Boolean logic. So our NAND gate truth table looks like this. If x1 and x2 are 1, then the output should be 0. If x1 is 1 and x2 is 0, the output should be 1. x1 is 0, x2 is 1, output should be 1. And if both of them are 0, still the output is 1. So it's opposite of an AND gate. In AND gate, you would have had a 1 only when both of them are 1. Otherwise, it's 0. So you can create a perceptron which has the weights -2 and -2 in both of the weights and a bias of 3. If you feed in the values of x1 and x2 given over here in the truth table, you will see that the output corresponds to the following numbers. This means that our perceptron, a very simple perceptron, can act as an AND gate. Hence, if we combine multiple perceptrons, we can achieve any Boolean logic. So that is the power of perceptrons. If we can find out the exact weights of these perceptrons and the bias, we'll be able to create any kind of Boolean logic. And you can expand the idea. I just now said you can combine lots and lots of NAND gates or perceptrons. So this is the way you can combine a lots of perceptrons. You can have a lot of input uh, conditions. You can have lots of output perceptron nodes, and you can keep on combining many layers to generate a very complicated structure which can model very complicated decisions. We saw that one perceptron can handle very limited kind of very simple models, but by combining a lot of perceptrons, you can generate any kind of decision which is possible. But perceptrons are not that powerful. The very first thing which comes to the mind is, if we have so many perceptrons, how do we find the values of the weights and the bias? We cannot start manually actually doing this, right? So they are not learnable automatically, and small changes can cause no changes or drastic changes in the output. So let's say we keep on changing the value of one weight of a perceptron. It can happen that the output does not change. We can look at this example by seeing over here, even if we changed the value of this weight to minus 2.1, still the NAND truth table will remain the same. Even a weight of minus 2.1 will act very similar to having a weight minus 2. So we cannot change the weights slightly to understand how the output will change, and hence we do not get any idea how this particular weight affects the decision of the entire output. Hence, we are not able to find out what are the changes we need to make in this entire model so that we are able to get the desired conditions that we want. So how do we solve this problem? First of all, to solve the problem of perceptrons, let's understand perceptrons in a better way. We can do that by analyzing the unit step function. What is a unit step function? This is the graph of a unit step function. For values greater than 0, the value of the function is 1. For values less than 0, the value of the function is 0. And on 0, the value is taken to be 1. That means that whenever the input given is greater than 0, the output is 1. And whenever the input is less than 0, the output is 0. This looks very similar to the thresholding function in our perceptrons. If wx plus b is greater than 0, when we have the output 1, if wx plus b is less than 0, we have the output 0. So that is the unit step function, but we can create more complicated functions from this unit step function which will exactly match our perceptron. So to do that, first of all, you can think of a shifted unit step function. What it means is that when let's say we have a step function and only for values greater than 4, the value is 1, and for values less than 4, the output of the function is 0. So you can see our 4 over here acts in a similar way like the bias. So based upon the bias values, the thresholding point changes. Also, you can combine multiple unit step functions. You can add or subtract two unit step functions to create functions which behave like this. They have a value of 1 between two numbers, let's say 2 and 3, and for all other values it's 0. So you can combine multiple unit step functions to create complicated decisions. Like if the value is only between 2 and 3, you want to go for some, let's say you want to take a decision as positive, otherwise you take the value as negative. Combining this kind of function, if you are able to create a bump, then you can combine multiple kinds of bumps and create any possible function that you want to. Now that we have established that the unit step function is very similar to perceptrons, we can have a look at the problem. The problem is this sudden bump, because if we change the value of our weights, then still the output of this function remains the same for a lot of duration. And the change is drastic. Once our input goes beyond 2.1 to 1.9, the output directly becomes 0. Hence, this is the problem with perceptrons, and that is why it is not learnable automatically. Neither we can predict how the output will change when we are changing the input for very complicated perceptrons. So what is the solution for solving this perceptron problem? We introduce the sigmoid function. Now let's revise what are the problems that we want to solve. The first problem that we want to solve is that we want to make the changes continuous. And the second thing is that we want our outputs to still be deterministic. Earlier in perceptrons, we had the good property that it gave only the output as 0 or 1, which corresponded to true or false. So we want our functions to have binary outputs or deterministic outputs, yet we want our functions to be continuous so that there is no drastic changes when the input changes. So there is no drastic change in the output. So this is how we can have a function which is continuous. It behaves nearly similar as our perceptrons. So in perceptrons or unit step functions, we have a drastic change going from 0 to 1 when the values change from negative to positive. But in sigmoid, the change is gradual. And yet, for very large values of x, the output tends towards 1. For very large negative values of x, the output tends towards 0. The exact mathematical formulation of the sigmoid function is 1 by 1 plus e to the power minus x. You can do the mental mathematics, feed in a very large value of x, and e to the power minus x will tend towards 0. So your output will tend towards 1. But when your x becomes a very large negative value, e power minus x will become a very large value, and 1 by a very large value tends towards 0. So this is how the sigmoid function mathematical formulation is, and this is how the graph looks like. Now it has the properties that we wanted. Small changes in input now change the output incrementally. If we change the value of x, the output is not drastic, there is no drastic change, and there is a continuous change in the output. But we lost the ability to get deterministic outputs. We are not getting the output as 1 or 0. We are getting continuous values. But that's not a big issue. We can threshold the output. We can say that any value greater than 0.5 corresponds to 1 when you are finally getting the output, and every value which is less than 0.5 corresponds to the output 0. So that is how we can finally convert our continuous values to deterministic values in the output, in the final, when we want to get the output. The next question that comes to the mind is sigmoid the only function that looks like this, which gradually changes its values and is 1 when x tends to infinity and is 0 when x tends to minus infinity? Is there no other function which looks like this? That's not true. There are many other functions which look like this and behave like the sigmoid function. I'll show you one more example, which is the tan inverse x, and there are many other functions. So sigmoid is one of them and it works good. So people have practically tried it out. Instead of using perceptrons, they have used sigmoid functions and it gives good results. So talking about the tan inverse x function, it's very similar to the um, sigmoid function. If you have a look at the tan inverse x function, its mathematical formulation is just 2 into sigmoid minus 1. So 2 into sigmoid will bring the output values going from 0 till 2, and when you do a minus 1, the output goes from nearly minus 1 to 1. So the tan inverse x formulation, so this is the tan inverse x function, and it goes from minus pi by 2 to pi by 2. But there is the tan h function, tan hyperbolic function, which has the formulation as 2 into sigmoid minus 1. Now this tan inverse x function also behaves very similar to the sigmoid function. Moreover, you can realize that you are not limited to the output of 0 and just 1. You can have the output as going from minus 1 to 1, and you can then finally threshold the outputs. If the output is greater than 0, you say it's 1. If the output is less than 0, then you say it's minus 1. So there is no limitation as to the output should only be 0 or 1. You can threshold in any way you want and have any function you like as long as it's not linear. If the function is linear, then any number of layers you add, they finally correspond to just a linear regression formulation. If you have multiple weight matrices, Wx, but to keep on multiplying linear Ws, let's say W1, W2, W3, and then you have the input matrix X, you can multiply this W1, W2, W3 to get a common matrix, let's say named A, and then your formulation becomes AX. So combining linear layers just correspond to having one linear layer. So there is no advantage of creating complicated functions using linear regression. But when you have a non-linear layer like the sigmoid or the perceptron or the tanh activation function, so these are different activation functions. If you have non-linear activation functions, then you can create complicated decision-making processes. So there are many functions which can act as activation functions, and we'll have a look at more of them in the later sessions. And that brings us to neural networks. A perceptron having a non-linear activation function which is continuous is called a neural network. This is a mathematical model of a neural network. It will look very similar to what we have been doing right now. We had a perceptron, and the output of the perceptron of the first layer can be modeled like this. We have a W1 matrix corresponding to the weights. We multiply it with the inputs X, and we add the bias terms to get the output Z1. For perceptrons, the activation function was actually a thresholding function. If the value was greater than 0, we had the output 1. If it was less than 0, we had the output 0. For sigmoid, the activation function became 1 by 1 plus e to the power minus x. And if you use that activation function, let's say a sigmoid activation function, then instead of calling it perceptrons, you call it neural networks. So when you use activation function as sigmoid, you get A1, which is the output of this neurons. So A corresponds to activation. So it's the activation of the first layer. Then you again multiply it with the weights of the second hidden layers. You add the bias, and you finally get the output, which is the Z2. So neural networks are nothing but perceptrons having continuous activation functions, continuous non-linear activation functions. So what are deep neural networks? You will hear a lot of terms like deep neural networks, and what it means is that you have multiple hidden layers. If you combine multiple layers and join them one after the other, then it's called a deep neural network. It is also called feed-forward neural networks. It's just one and the same thing. And sometimes people call it multi-layer perceptrons as well. So these are just some terms which are used interchangeably for neural networks. So do not be afraid if you are reading some blog and they use deep neural networks or multi-layer perceptrons or any other jargon. They all correspond to the same meaning, which is a perceptron kind of architecture, which has non-linear activation functions. That's it. So right now, you can think of a neural network as a black box. You have a function, the weights are there, you have a corresponding weights, and corresponding to the inputs, for one input, you'll get the output that you want to have. So a real life example can be that you have an image as the input layer, and you have a classification output saying whether it's a dog or a cat and so on as the output. So if the output is a dog, then the first neuron becomes 1, and all the other neurons should have an output of 0. If it's a cat, then the second neuron has an output or activation of 1, and all other neurons are 0. So you can configure the parameters or weights of your network in such a way that if the input image is of a cat, then the output corresponding to the second neuron is always 1. If you are able to find such parameters, then you will be able to apply it in real life to classify whether this image is a cat or a dog. So that is a real example of neural networks. And you can think of neural networks as a black box. You feed it in some input and you expect some output from it. Understanding how exactly the input corresponds to the output is very complicated because there are a lot of weights and parameters, and you can't truly understand how changing one parameter affects the output. You can understand how changing the weights would change the values of the output, but you truly can't understand what each weight corresponds to, what it is looking in the image. So that is why many people call neural networks as a black box, because it's hard to understand how they function exactly. But neural networks, they are understandable. You just need to pry harder into them. For now, we'll treat our neural network as a black box and try to understand how exactly the data is fed into the neural network and how to extract the output from our neural networks. So first of all, even though neural networks are black box, they do not convert potatoes into gold. Neural networks are just a hypothesis function. They take in some numbers and convert it out as numbers. So our neural networks are some functions which will take in a sequence of numbers, lots of numbers, and then it will output a number. But our real life data, it does not have numbers. Our images do not have numbers, or the way I am talking, that is not a number. So how do we convert our data, which we have in real life, into numbers? So let's understand related to some specific data tasks, like you have some data like images, audio, chat, and so on. So how do we convert these type of data into numbers? So let's start by understanding images. You must have learned in your primary school that if you mix some colors, you'll get different kinds of colors. So if you mix red and green, you get yellow. If you mix red and blue, as you can see over here, you get some pinkish color. If you mix all of these three colors, red, green, and blue, then you'll get the color white. Similar kind of ideology is used when we convert images into numbers. When we have an image, we convert it into three numbers. Each pixel in the image, which corresponds to each point in the image, is made up of three values: how much red color the image has, how much the green color the image has, and how much the blue color the image has. By combining these three values, you can generate any kind of color possible and show it in an image. Each color in our computers, when we store an image, the R, G, and B values can take values going from 0 to 255. So there are total 256 shades of each color, and combining them, you can create a total number of colors of 256 into 256 into 256, which is a huge value, and you can generate nearly all the colors which a human can perceive by using these many number of values. So 000 corresponds to no red, no green, and no blue, which corresponds to the black color. And 255, 255, 255 corresponds to the red, green plus blue, which is the white color. Similarly, you can mix different values of red, green, and blue to get any color that you want to. You can visualize the way the image is stored in a computer as a 3D array. You have a height, you have a width, and you have three values corresponding to each point in the image. So for each point, you have a red color, a green color, and a blue color. Hence, three dimensions in the depth. So height cross width cross 3. If you have a grayscale image, then you only require one value specifying the intensity of the light. So in a grayscale image, you have just one channel which takes values from 0 to 255. So that is how you store images in your computer, and that is how you convert your images into numbers. You can feed out these numbers into a neural network, so the neural network is able to understand the data. You can flatten this array. You can convert this 3D array to a 1D array to feed it into your neural networks, which you have seen till now. Or there are some kind of neural networks which are specialized for images, which will take in the image as it is, height, width, and channels, and process the data accordingly. So there are multiple kinds of neural networks, and depending upon that, you will process your image. So the final takeaway is that you can convert your images to numbers by following this kind of strategy. Next is understanding text. So you must have heard about chatbots. Now, in chatbots, you have some text and you want to convert that into numbers so that your neural network is able to understand the data. So now let's say we have this is big data AI book. How is it exactly stored in your computer? Every character has an ASCII value. Now you can store the character's ASCII value, and that ASCII value is actually a number. Hence every character, even the space, has an ASCII value, and you can convert this into a string of numbers and you can feed that into a neural network. That is one way to feed data into your neural network, and that does not work well. So empirically, people have found out that that is not a good way to feed in data into a neural network, and there are some other ways in which you can convert your data into numbers. One of the ways is by unigram, bigram, or trigram. So what it means is that you have a sentence which has the following words: this is big data AI book. In the unigram method, you will break down each of the words and then you'll convert each word to a number. So you say that this corresponds to the number 0, is corresponds to the number 1, big corresponds to the number 2, and so on. If this is repeated again somewhere later along in the data set, then you will again say that this word has the value 0, and so on. Hence you convert each word to a unique number and then feed it to your network. Now why is that good? Because if you would have fed the ASCII values of THIS, then your model would have to learn the dependency between each of the ASCII values to be able to understand what this word means. But over here, because we give it a combined value for THIS, hence the model is able to understand the entire word in a one go. It does not need to create its own representation of what this means. So that is one way of processing your data. Then there is the bigram method. Going forward on our previous idea that we thought that giving in the character values of ASCII values of each character might be too complicated for the model to make sense of, we provided it with words. But we can combine multiple words and provide them a unique value, a unique number, such that the model is able to understand the combined meaning of these two words. So if we combine this is big, big data, data AI, and AI book, we get the bigrams, and each bigram is provided a unique number. So we feed in the unique number to the neural networks, and neural networks will automatically start understanding the structure of the sentence using combination of two words. This in practice seems to work well, though there is the computation trade-off that now if there were n words, you will have in bigram, you will have n square number of words in your data set now. Hence, your neural network size or your hypothesis function size would also become very large. So depending upon the computations you have, you will choose unigram, bigram, or the third form, which is the trigram, where you merge three different words, provide each of these combination of words a unique value, and then generate your entire data. So this is how you combine or you process your text into numbers so that the neural network is able to understand it. Next comes the audio data. So these are the three popular kinds of data sets. The first being the images, next being the text or the chat, and third being the audio. In audio, when you speak, we already store audio on our computer, and the way it is done is using a microphone. In the microphone, there is a magnet which vibrates. So there is a diaphragm which vibrates because of the pressure changes in the uh, air when you speak. These pressure changes are recorded using a magnet, and it's converted into an electrical signal which is stored in your computer. So the values of these pressures are converted into electrical signals and stored as binary numbers in your computer. So you can use that audio, which is stored as the pressure values of the air when you were speaking, and you can feed in these values directly to our network and ask it to convert it into the corresponding output that you want. Now, this also sometimes does not work well. There are some hypothesis functions or neural networks which will perform good when directly given the pressure data in your audio, but there are some networks which do not work well. For them, we provide the short-term Fourier transform. So using Fourier transform, you can convert the time domain to the frequency domain, and using short time frequency domains, you preserve the temporal changes in the frequency spectrum, and you can feed that into a neural network so that it is able to understand the audio data. If you are not familiar with what Fourier transform is or what short-term Fourier transform means, you can have a look on the internet, because this goes beyond the scope of understanding what neural networks exactly are. So that is how you process audio. You either feed in the entire temporal data just as the pressure values, or you can convert it into Fourier transform and then feed that into your neural network. So that was all regarding how to process your input data corresponding to three different kind of tasks: images, chat, and audio. Now there are different kinds of outputs as well, and these are the two types of outputs. One is the categorical, where we have a category of, let's say, dogs, cats, and so on. We have discrete outputs. Whereas there can be another kind of output, which is the continuous outputs, which is, let's say, we want to predict the value of what the house price would be after a certain number of years. That prediction is a continuous value. It's not categorical like predicting a dog or a cat. So that is why you have two different types of outputs, and based upon the different types of outputs, you'll have different kinds of architecture itself. So if you have a categorical output, you will have the way you can output the categorical outputs by using one hot encoding. And if you have continuous outputs, then you can have just one neuron output in your uh, hypothesis function, which can take any values. It's not constrained between 0 to 1. You can you cannot apply an activation function. Hence, wx plus b can take any values from minus infinity to plus infinity, and that is why your output can have a continuous value. So these are the different architectural changes that you need to make depending upon whether your output is categorical or continuous. So these were the very basics of how to convert your input data and how to change the architecture based upon the type of output you have. Now we'll have a look at the MNIST task. MNIST task contains handwritten digits, and we want to classify which digit is shown in the image. So this is the output is categorical. Hence we'll see how you can create a categorical model on the MNIST dataset. So these are some images which are sampled from the handwritten digit classifier, so MNIST dataset. So we have images like these 504, and in the dataset we have the corresponding targets as well. In the dataset, it has been mentioned that this image has the 5 digit, this image has the 0 digit, and so on. The full form of MNIST is Modified National Institute of Standards and Technology. no need to remember this full form, just this is for information. There are a total of 60,000 images for training. So there are 60,000 images like this, and we have the corresponding targets as well. We have 10,000 images for testing. The training and the testing images should be different, because if the model performs good on the training images, it does not mean that it will perform well on some new dataset that is shown. That is because of overfitting. That is why we keep out a stack of 10,000 images for testing, and we do not train our hypothesis function on the 10,000 images. Also, the 10,000 images for testing and the 60,000 images for training are from two completely different sets of people, to see whether our model generalizes well from different people to different kinds of people. Also, one specification about the dataset: the images are of size 28 cross 28. So there are 28 rows and 28 columns, and the value of each pixel is grayscale. So there are no three channels, there is only one channel corresponding to each pixel. Also, the grayscale corresponds to 0 to 255, as I told you earlier. But when we are training our neural networks, we divide the value of the pixels by 255 and bring the input between 0 and 1. That is how we usually train our neural networks. Sometimes we even subtract 0 0.5 from the input to bring the input range between a negative number to a positive number, to better have the neural networks have a better training. How do we have how do we create the architecture for training this neural network? So first of all, we have an image which has 28 rows and 28 columns. We flatten the input to have only one single dimension. So if you convert your 28 rows and 28 columns and you flatten them, you will get a one-dimensional array of size 784. And each of the inputs will have a value between 0 and 1. So this is our input layer, which has 784 values corresponding to each image. So if we create a network which takes in 784 values and it gives 10 outputs, these 10 outputs, for let's say the image is 0, then we want the output neuron 0 to have a value of 1, and all other neurons should have an output of 0. If we give it an image of 1, of let's say 28 cross 20, and 1 is drawn, then the output layer should have 0, 1, 0, 0, 0, 0, and so on. Similarly, if we give it an image of let's say 9, then all should be 0 except for the last output neuron. If we are able to find out a network architecture which has weights such that when you give in the image corresponding to 9, it will give an output of the ninth neuron as 1, then our task is solved. That is what we want to achieve. We want to find the parameters of this network in such a way that when we feed it image, it gives the correct output. Now, once we have, so obviously, when we are training our model, we'll not get exactly 1 as the output. We would have gotten a 1 as the output when we used perceptrons, but we already saw what were the problems with perceptrons. Over here, let's say we use sigmoid activation function, then we'll get a continuous value output. So instead of this being completely 1, this value might be 0.9. The eighth neuron might give, instead of 0, it might give a value of 0.1, and so on. So you can just take the maximum value of all the neurons and then take that as the output. So if what we want now is, if the image is 9, then the output of the ninth neuron should be maximum compared to all the other neurons. And hence, if that is so, then our output will be 9. So if we are able to find our weights, then we can achieve the corresponding task, and we would have created a mathematical function which takes in an image and gives the output of what digit it is. Also, because this is not a perceptron, we can change the weight slightly and see the corresponding changes in the output based on the changes in the weights. So now the task is we have converted our input images, we know what output we want, we have a model architecture, we just need to find out the set of weights which will make this architecture work. How many weights do we have? We have 74 inputs. Let's say we have 30 hidden neurons. Then we have a total number of weights corresponding to 784 into 30. In the next layer, we have 30 neurons. Hence, we have a bias of 30. So we have plus 30 weights. And in the next output layer, we have 10 neurons. So we have 30 into 10 weights. So these lines, these threads, you can think of them as weights. So we have a total of 300 lines over here. So we have plus 30 into 10. And then finally, for each output, we'll have a bias. So you have 10 more parameters. This corresponds to a total of 23,860 neurons. So you have to find the value of these many neurons to be able to create the handwritten digit classifier task. So here comes why the demand of data scientists in market is large. What data scientists actually do is they manually change the value of each weight to make the network work. They start with some random weights and they change the value of one weight and see how the output changes. If, let's say for 9, you're getting a low value in the final output, you'll change the value of one weight and see if the value of 9 increases. Then you'll feed in a value of 8 and then check how to increase the value of the neuron 8. And that is why there is a lot of demand of data scientists in the market. Sometimes these models can contain billions of weights. So that is why we require lots and lots of people for creating good models. And that is why a lot of people are getting hired. I'm just kidding. That's not true. Nobody actually manually can set the value of billions of weights or manually change the value of weights to uh, get the corresponding correct output. It's humanly impossible to manually change the value of weights so that you can get the corresponding correct outputs because you have tens of thousands of images. For each of them, you want to get a correct value. So if you start manually changing one value at a time, it might take you years or I do not know, a century to be able to train even a very small network. So that is not how we are going to approach our neural networks task. There should be some smart way by which we can find the parameters of this network. We'll learn about it later on. So let's start understanding how to go towards automatic learning of the parameters of neural networks, and we'll start with understanding what loss functions are. So first of all, we want to define a mathematical model to automate the task of learning the weights of the neural networks. So now, if you have a look at what are the different components while creating a neural network, there is the first, the input. So input we have already converted into numbers. For creating a mathematical model, we want all of our data to be in numbers. So we have our input in numbers. We also have the output in numbers. We have achieved that. The function parameters, weights and biases are in numbers. So that's also a good sign. We have a continuous, the input is numbers, the weights are numbers, the output is number as well. But we need a metric to compare our models in mathematical terms. I have yet now talked about we want a good model which is going to be able to classify well. Good and well are not mathematical, they are very vague concepts. If I am able to define exactly what a good model means, then only I will be able to compare different models and find out the best model compared to the metric. So let's define a metric, a mathematical metric, which we'll use to compare our different architectures. So accuracy is one such metric which measures how many correct samples. So we have, let's say, 10,000 images in the testing data set, and our model got 9,000 samples correct. So our accuracy would be 9,000 by 10,000, which is the total number of samples. So correct samples by total samples. Hence our accuracy will be 90% for the model. This is a mathematical statement and it corresponds very good to the metric that we want to have. If the accuracy is larger, then that means our model is better and we want to improve the accuracy of the model to 100% if possible. So accuracy is a very good metric, but it has a problem. Accuracy has the same problem as perceptrons, and even if we change the value of weights slightly, the accuracy might not change, because while calculating accuracy, we take the threshold, we take the maximum of all the neurons, and the maximum function is not continuous. Even if we change the value of one neuron slightly, the maximum might not change. Hence, the accuracy is, even though it's a good metric for comparing models, because it is not continuous, it is not useful for us. We'll see later on why we need continuous systems to be able to automate the process of training your neural networks. So even though accuracy is good, we cannot use it because it's not continuous. So points about accuracy: it is practical, it is what we want to increase, but it's not continuous. So the next thing we go on to is the mean squared error function. The mean squared error is just the squared difference between what we want our output to be and what it actually is. So let's say our neuron gives an output of 0.1, but we wanted the output to be 1. So the mean squared error would be 1 minus 0.1 whole square. So that is what the mean squared error is. This mean squared error is not practical. Even if we decrease the mean squared error value, it does not guaranteed mean that our model is improving. We can understand that by examples. You can think about some examples in which, even though the mean squared error of a model is smaller, it might perform bad on the accuracy, which is what we actually want to increase. So mean squared error is not practical, because if I say my model has a better mean squared error, it has a lower mean squared error than the other model, it does not necessarily mean that my model is good. It gives hazy interpretations. If I say my model has an MSE of 0.1, that actually does not mean anything. That depends. There are a lot of factors which can change the value of your MSE. One such factor being, if you just scale down the value of your outputs, instead of 0 to 1, you have, let's say, 0 to 0.1 as the output range, automatically your mean squared error values would become 100 times smaller. So MSE, it gives hazy interpretations. It does not give concrete interpretations like the accuracy. But the only good thing about MSE is that it is continuous. If the output changes slightly, the mean squared error would also change slightly. So the mean squared error is continuous, and hence it is good for us, and it will help us to automate the task of finding the best values for the weights of the neural network. So even though it's not a good metric, as it is continuous and it is an okay metric, it's not a bad metric, because if the MSE of a model is low, then it's a very high probability that that model will have a good accuracy as well. So even though it's not the best possible case, but as it is continuous and it's good enough, we can use MSE for calculating, for finding the optimal parameters of our network. And MSE has the following equation. So yi is the output of our neuron, yi hat is the expected output or the target of the neuron. We take the difference, we compute the square, and we add them up for all the neurons and all the samples. So in our training data set, we have 60,000 images. And if you calculate the expected, so you subtract the output of one sample with the other sample, so the target, and you square it and you add them up for all the samples and you divide them by 60,000. Let's say you divide it by 1 by 60,000, multiply it by 1 by 60,000. Then the value of MSE you get we'll be able to compare the values of different models of MSE and say which is better. So this is what the term in MSE corresponds to. There are other loss functions as well. We just saw at the mean squared error loss function. Then there is the cross entropy loss. So let's understand the mathematical formulation of the cross entropy loss. Looking at the graph, let's first understand whether if we minimize the cross entropy loss, will it give us a good model or not? Okay, so you can see that over here we have for y equal to 1 the red graph, and for y equal to 0 we have the black graph. What it means is that when our target is 1, so on the x-axis we have the predicted values of our neuron. When the target is 1 and our prediction value is 0, which corresponds to a very large value on the red graph, then the loss is very high. If our prediction starts increasing, let's say it becomes 1, then the value of the loss is 0 for the target of y equal to 1. So this is a good loss function because when we want the neuron to give a output of 1, then the loss function is very high if it gives a value of 0 as the output, and the loss function is 0 when it gives the output of exactly 1. Similarly, if we have a target of 0 and the model predicts 1, which is a very bad scenario, the value of this loss is very high. But if the model exactly predicts 0 as it was supposed to, then the loss is 0. So depending upon the target, we have a different graph, and if we add all of these terms, then we'll finally get the cross entropy loss. If we train our model to minimize the value of this loss, then we'll get a good enough hyperparameters, or we'll get optimal parameters which will have a good accuracy as well. So this is how the CL looks in a graph, and this is the mathematical formulation. To understand this, you can set the value of yi, which is yi hat. So over here, there is a slight change in the notations. Yi corresponds to the target output, which can be 1 or 0, and yi hat corresponds to the predicted output. So if yi is set to 1, then the second term in this loss, which is 1 minus 1, it becomes 0. So the second term is discarded, and we only have the first term corresponding to 1 into log predicted y. So we have just a minus 1 by m log y when the target output is 1, and when the target output is 0, the first term becomes 0, and we have only the second term corresponding to log of 1 minus y. If you try to visualize how these graphs would look like, you would get the graphs shown in the left hand side. So this is the mathematical formulation of the cross entropy loss. Also, you have the softmax activation function. When you are using the cross entropy loss, you want your values to always stay between the values 0 to 1. You can use a sigmoid function for that, or you can use the softmax activation function. What the softmax activation function looks like is this. This is the mathematical formulation of the softmax activation function. Let's say you in the output layer, you have these many numbers. Okay. Now you take e to the power of 1.3 divided by sum of e to the power of all the numbers. So in the denominator, you have something like e to the power 1.3 plus e to the power 5.1 plus e to the power 2.2 and so on. And in the numerator, for the first neuron, you have e to the power 1.3. For the second neuron, you have e to the power 5.1 and so on. So finally, in the output, you'll get some numbers which are always less than 1 because the numerator will always be smaller than the denominator. The values are positive because e to the power any number remains positive. And if you sum of the values of the output, you'll always get it equal to 1. So if you sum all the values, then in the numerator, you'll get sum I equal to 1 to k e to the power zi, and the numerator and the denominator will cancel out to give a value of 1. So if the sum is 1, the range of the values remain between 0 to 1. You can think of them as probabilities. Though they are not truly probabilities, you can think of them as probabilities, and that is what a softmax activation function gives us. So in the final layer, you can apply the softmax activation function, normalize your values between 0 to 1, and then apply the cross entropy loss. So that is it for the loss function, cross entropy loss. And you also learned one more thing, which is the softmax activation function. Now, why only the squared loss or the cross entropy loss? Are there no other kinds of loss possible? We can have the loss mod x as well. So mod x or norm of x corresponds to a function which looks like this. So it has a positive value for x not equal to 0. Let's say our prediction, we want the value to be 0. Then norm x tends towards 0. So it's a loss function which has the value 0. It is continuous because there is no drastic change in the value of the output. It does not have a smooth, so the derivative is not smooth. The derivative changes drastically at this point, but that's still good enough. Till now, we have only looked at the condition that the function should be continuous. It can be, the derivative can be non-continuous for some points, and it does not actually matter for the method we are going to use for finding the optimal parameters, which we have not yet talked about. But just take this from me, the continuous values are fine. So mod x is also fine. So sometimes we use the norm of x or mod x as a loss function to train our models, and it is called the L1 loss. We can also have the function x power 4 that also works, but people have experimented with mod x or x square and have usually found that x square works good empirically. So that is why we use the mean squared loss function and not mean x quadratic loss function or the norm of x usually as the loss functions. You can keep on creating your own loss function, try to train your model, and if it works good, then that's good enough for your current architecture. But usually x square works well enough. Now there is some extra information. There is the focal loss as well, in which you can change the way the cross entropy loss reduces by multiplying a factor like 1 minus p to the power gamma. You can read about this in the focal loss paper, and you can change the rate at which the loss changes, and you can fine tune the value of your gamma so that it is the loss function works good for your particular architecture. So depending upon your task, you can change the values of your gamma, and if you get better results, then you continue on with that corresponding loss. So all of the types of losses, there are a lot of losses, and depending upon your task and your requirements, you will have to experiment and find out which works good for you. Then there is the dice loss. So let's say you have a prediction, like you want to predict where a bicycle is in an image. Now, how do you exactly calculate whether your prediction is correct or not? If you try to match the coordinates of the bounding box, let's say you have a ground truth which looks like this, it has 4 coordinates, and your prediction is like this. If you try to exactly match the coordinates of the predicted uh, corners of the box, then the value of this prediction and the ground truth remains 0 till the prediction exactly does not match the ground truth. So that is not a continuous value. To get a continuous value, you can have this kind of loss, which is called the dice loss. In the dice loss, in the numerator, you have the intersection area of the bounding boxes divided by the union or the combined area of the predicted as well as the ground truth. If you try to maximize the value of this loss, then ideally if when the predicted and the ground truth overlap together, then the value of this dice loss is maximum and equal to 1. So you can have different kinds of loss depending upon the task you want to achieve, and that is how you train your networks to your optimal value. Then there is the CTC loss or connectionist temporal classification loss, and that is good when you want to train a network which has variable length output and you do not know exactly at what time step the output should correspond to. So let's say you have the output as AB, you have two letters and you have an image. Now you do not know, let's say you want to predict for each column what is the current letter, but you do not have in your final output or target what is the corresponding character present in each column. You do not know that there is an A in this column, A in this column, A in this column, and B in the last two columns. You do not have that information. Still, you can train your model to optimal values using the connectionist temporal classification loss. You can read about it on distill.pub. There is a very good graphical visualization of what this connectionist temporal classification loss is and how if you try to minimize this loss, then the model will automatically learn to predict the correct values for each column. So these are some extra information regarding loss functions which you might find useful if you start exploring other fields in neural networks. Now that we understood what loss functions are and how you can use various kinds of loss functions depending upon the task you have, let us try to understand the data space. So we'll take a very simple example, which is, let's say you have a point which has the value 3, 5, and 4. So it has 3 dimensions, and you can visualize this point in a 3-dimension space. On the x-axis, you have the value 3. On the y-axis, you have the value 5. On the z-axis, you have the value 4. And if you plot a point, you can visualize it like this. Now, think of the MNIST dataset. You have a data point which has 784 dimensions. As there are 784 pixels, your one data corresponds to 784 values. Each value can be between 0 to 1. Because it's grayscale, the value should have been between 0 to 255, but I have normalized it. I have divided it by 255 and brought the values between 0 to 1. So we have 784 dimensions. Each can take a value between 0 to 1, and the entire data set, 60,000 images, they correspond to some points in the 784 dimension space. So that is what the entire data space is, where each data corresponds to just one point in the data space. Now, this MNIST data set is very small. It has only 28 rows and 28 columns. But in real life, you'll have images which have thousands of rows and thousands of columns, and your data points you have millions of data points corresponding to millions of images in billion dimension spaces. So you have billions of pixels and you can have millions of data points in those billion dimension spaces. So visualizing such a data space can become very complicated. Why do we need to visualize the data space? Because finally, what we want to do is, in this data space, we want to create compartments in which if a data point lies, we say that it belongs to a certain class. So we can say all points which come inside this rectangle, they belong to the dog images. Or if there is some other rectangle, if the data point lies inside the rectangle, we say it belongs to cat images. So we want to compartmentalize our data space, a billion dimension data space, into compartments which correspond to different classes in the output. That is what the task we are trying to achieve is. And we are trying to compartmentalize by using the neural networks function. We feed in the data point and our neural network says which compartment the data point belongs to. So our neural networks is learning the compartments of the data space. So this is what our task is, and it will be good if you can visualize your tasks in the data space. So how do we visualize a data space which has a billion dimensions? You cannot. You cannot visualize more than 3 dimensions. Even people who visualize 4 dimensions, they use some tricks, but going beyond 4 dimensions is very, very complicated. What you can do actually is you can draw simple examples in the 3 dimension space and use the corresponding analogy in the higher dimension spaces. Once you start getting familiar with these higher dimension spaces, you will start understanding where your analogy of the 3 dimension space works in your billion dimension space and when the analogy fails. You will get this by experience and by getting familiar with different kinds of neural network tasks. So do not get intimidated if you see a lot of dimensions having like billion dimension space. Nobody is able to visualize those dimensions. But with experience, people start drawing analogies from the 3 dimension space to the billion dimension space to better understand what exactly is happening. So the takeaway note is the actual space is very large. You can visualize them in 2 dimensions. There are some methods like t-SNE, or you can do a principal component analysis to visualize your data. But finally, they are just crude representations of the amount of data you have. So the space is very large, but don't be intimidated. Work by imagining that your data lies in 3 dimensions and draw conclusions from there, which will help you to understand the large dimension spaces.